Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd. Our chronological study of the scriptures brings us today to the book of Ruth, and our scripture reading, Ruth chapter 1 and 2. Now, I've titled the devotional, Ruth, a Testament of Sovereignty and Providence. Now, the book of Ruth bridges two eras. Its historical context is during the time and days when judges ruled Israel, Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1. However, the book of Ruth is before kings reigned in the land. Now, the book of Ruth has been cherished by Jewish people and Bible believers alike. It also establishes the ancestry of King David and the genealogy of Jesus Christ in the lineage of David as a descendant of the tribe of Judah. Now, in our brief study of the book of Ruth, you will see a testimony of God's sovereignty and be reminded that the Lord overrules human affairs and is providentially at work to fulfill his will through the frailty of human decisions. Now, the book of Ruth is also a testament to the Lord's redemption, as it reveals how Ruth, a Moabite woman with no claim to inheritance among God's people, that same Ruth came to be named in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Well, Ruth chapter 1, I invite you to consider in the first 4 verses what I would describe as a prodigal family. Now, the opening verses of Ruth introduce us to a family facing a crisis of faith. And so we read, there was a famine in the land. And so the decision was made to leave Bethlehem, Judah. Now, that's the same Bethlehem, a village in Judah in which ultimately Jesus Christ would be born. But this family made a decision to leave Bethlehem of Judah, and they traveled to the country of Moab. Now, Moab being apart from Israel. Now, to escape the famine, we read that a man by the name of Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and his sons Mahlon and Chilion, descendants of Ephraim, moved to Moab, where they lived for 10 years, according to verse 4. Now, Elimelech's decision to leave Bethlehem as he died in Moab, leaving a widow with 2 sons. So it begins a time of calamity. Now, they continued to live in Moab after the death of Elimelech, and Naomi's sons, we read, took Moabite wives. The one named Mahlon took Ruth as his wife. The other, his brother, took Chilion, who married a Moabite woman named Orpah. Now, we have then recorded verses 5 through 9, what I would describe as Naomi's sorrows. And so tragedy struck Naomi's life again when we read in verse 5 that both of her sons died. So not only has her husband Elimelech died, but now both sons have died. And she and her daughter-in-laws were widows, according to verse 5. Now, understanding the culture of the day and that widows had no social welfare, the 3 women together, now all widows, faced a desperate and uncertain future. Now, when Naomi heard that the famine had passed, we read that she set her heart on returning home to Bethlehem in verse 6. And so she urged her daughters-in-law to return to their parents and hoped that they might marry Moabite men in verses 8 to 9. And yet Ruth and Orpah refused, and they were determined to accompany Naomi to Israel. Nevertheless, we read that she blessed and encouraged them in verse 9 to return home and seek a husband. And yet now we have this wonderful picture of a bond of love between Naomi and Ruth, beginning in verse 10 through verse 17. Now, this bond of love between Naomi and her daughters-in-law was strong, and as they parted, we read, they lifted up their voice and wept. Now, we read that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and departed back into her people and unto her gods. Ruth, however, refused to return. Now, in one of the great confessions of faith in the Scriptures, Ruth said to Naomi, and I quote, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people," meaning the Jewish people, "shall be my people, and thy God, the God of Israel, my God." Verse 17, "Where thou diest, will I die. There will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee, Naomi, and me." Now, although Ruth was a Moabite and therefore outside God's covenant with Israel, Naomi accepted her promise of fidelity, that is her faithfulness. And they, Naomi and Ruth, journeyed together to Bethlehem. In verse 19, as the two widows entered the village, the people of the village were stirred by their appearance, and some question, "Is this Naomi?" Consider then verses 20 through 22, where we would have what I would describe as the toll of sorrows and the sovereignty of God. 10 years of sorrow had taken their toll, and Naomi's physical appearance undoubtedly revealed her hardships and disappointments. Naomi reflected the sorrows of her journey from the promised land to Moab, answered their inquiries, and confessed, and I quote verse 20, "Call me not Naomi," which means pleasant, "but call me Mara," meaning bitter. "For the Almighty El Shaddai hath dealt very bitterly with me. The Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty," again El Shaddai, the Eternal One, "hath afflicted me." Notice in verse 22 how Naomi and Ruth's arrival in Bethlehem providentially coincided with the beginning of barley harvest. Then Ruth chapter 2. In the first 3 verses, we are reminded of the providence of God. Now, although Ruth was a Moabite woman and a stranger among God's people, we read that the Lord used Naomi's wisdom to sovereignly direct Ruth, her daughter-in-law, to the fields of a man by the name of Boaz. Now, he was, according to verse 1, a mighty man, wealthy, and kindred of Naomi and Elimelech, her deceased husband. Well, true to her faithful and industrious character, Ruth went out to glean grain in the fields owned by Boaz in verse 2 and 3. And when Boaz came to visit the field, the workers in the field, we read that Boaz found an unfamiliar person among them, and he asked, "Whose damsel, whose woman is this?" Notice verse 4 through 7. And here we do have a wonderful description and insight into Ruth's industrious character. And so the servant who was supervising the field for Boaz identified Ruth as, and I quote, "the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab," verse 6. Well, the servant went on to explain how Ruth had requested to join the poor and glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. The servant commented, and I quote, "She came, and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house." Boaz would realize that Ruth was more than just a pretty face. Indeed, she was a woman of exceptional character. The Boaz's favor. And we will notice in verses 8 through 23 how this man named Boaz, a very wealthy, a very powerful man, was a wonderful model of God's grace. So understanding that Ruth was a widow of Naomi's kin, Boaz demonstrated God's grace and love for sinners. He spoke kindly to Ruth and insisted that she work only in his field among his maidens, where she could find both provision and safety. In verse 10, humbled by Boaz's favor, Ruth then fell before him and asked, "Why? Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger?" Boaz then recognized Ruth's testimony in Bethlehem, noting how she had left her country and family to accompany Naomi to a land and people she did not know. verse 11. And he understood that Ruth was a woman of faith, and in verse 12 prayed she would be rewarded by the Lord and receive his favor. Well, Ruth accepted Boaz's expression of grace with humility. And in verse 14, in a display of affection for Ruth, Boaz invited her to his table. And yet, she took her place with the reapers, who were hired servants, and ate enough to satisfy her hunger. And then we read she took the leftovers that she had home to Naomi. Now, verse 9 and then verses 14 through 16. Here we have this wonderful display of grace. And so in closing, I invite you to consider 3 ways that Boaz displayed grace to Ruth. The first, he offered her protection and instructed the men not to teach or touch her, verse 9. Then he made provisions for her, and we read in verse 15 and 16 how Boaz filled Ruth's hands with grain. And then finally, thirdly, in verse 14, she was promoted and became the object of Boaz's attention and affection. Well, we have in verses 18 through 23, Ruth's report to Naomi. That evening, when Ruth returned home to Naomi, she shared how Boaz had blessed her. Upon realizing the likelihood of the Lord's guidance, Naomi rejoiced and encouraged Ruth in verse 21 through 23, dispelling her bitterness with the hope of redemption. Well, you're going to see in the next study how this book that started with famine, death, and sorrow and bitterness transforms into a remarkable story of redemption, life, joy, and contentment. Well, thank you for being a part of our study. I look forward to continuing our study of this wonderful love story tomorrow. God bless, and bye-bye.